welcome to everyone. I thought we'd start on time and not punish those of you who were good enough to be here on time. Just by way of, everybody hear me okay? Okay. By way of some quick introductions, I'm Mike Pesci. I'm the president of Associate Community Management Corp. We're based in Clifton. Those of you who have been around the industry for a while may know that Community Management was a standalone, privately owned company. And we became part of Associa a little more than a year ago. Associa is a national company. We manage about 125 associations. Associa manages about 9,000 in total throughout the United States. So we're happy to be here. With me is Jeff Circus, one of our VPs, and our other VP, Neil Ross, will be joining us shortly. Jeff and Neil are going to tag team because we also are manning one of the advice booths at this very same time. So if you see them shuttling it out, it's not because anybody asked some obnoxious question that they were offended by. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. What we were asked to talk about today is some issues that are hopefully helpful to board members. And we came up with 8 of them. And I'll tell you quickly what they are so you have a roadmap of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about conducting open board meetings, Municipal Service Act claims, contracting by associations, communicating with your residents, alternative dispute resolution, orientation of new board members, effective use of committees, and record keeping and retention by associations. And again, Jeff and I are going to share some of the topics, and when Neil joins us, he'll handle a couple of others. I wonder if I could just get a sense of who's here, though. So can you raise your hand if you're a board member in a community? Okay, so we targeted it right. Are there any managers here? Okay, and some of my managers are here, by the way. I think they're here to critique me. So when you hear hard questions, you'll know where they're coming from. And how about other? None of the above? Okay. Well, great. So that I think hopefully we've got some topics that make sense. The format is going to be loose. We only have an hour with 8 topics. If you divide it up equally, it's 6 or 7 minutes per topic, so it's going to be bang, bang. I do, however, want to give an opportunity for questions. I don't want this to be a talking heads thing, so we're going to deliberately try to go quickly through each topic, and if you do have a question at the end of each topic, I'd love to entertain your comments or questions. Certainly you board members are living these issues every day, and my advice, which hopefully is practical, is only one point of view. So that obviously I can't let the questioning go on forever because we do need to move to the next topic. So if I don't call on you, understand I'm not trying to be rude. It just comes easily. Or so my wife says. All right, so we're going to start with conducting open board meetings. And I know, you veteran board members have been down this road a million times. However, I always think it's helpful, even for those of you who have done this for a long time, to just talk about what the law actually calls for, what it doesn't call for, and what skills are needed and what best practices are for conducting open board meetings, because it is a challenge. And I will tell you that going back to when I started in this industry 30 years ago, there was no open board meeting law. So that boards could meet in somebody's kitchen. The only meeting that had to be open to the membership was the annual meeting, the election meeting. That changed in roughly 1991 when New Jersey passed the equivalent of a sunshine law for condo board meetings. Shortly thereafter, when Trenton figured out that, oh shoot, not everybody's a condo, they did the same thing for other types of common interest communities, co-ops and homeowners associations. So now, for all intents and purposes, all types of community associations are governed by a sunshine law that largely mirrors the municipal model, but thank goodness is not identical. So what does it say? Effectively, it says that when the board makes decisions, it must do so at a meeting to which the membership is invited. The membership doesn't get to vote. but they do get to watch you vote. So how do you get there is easier said than done. So the first issue is the law is very specific as to how the membership is given notice of these meetings, and it's archaic. It says that you must give notice of meetings in two ways that could not be more ridiculous. The first is to post a notice in a conspicuous place on the common property. You know, in a place with a clubhouse, that makes sense. In a community, many of which I suspect you're involved in, with no clubhouse or no logical bulletin board, it makes no sense. Early on in this, after this law was passed, we in fact put up bulletin boards at the entrance to communities to try to at least comply with that aspect of the law. And the other part of the law is to give notice in two newspapers of common circulation. Now, does anybody for their condo board meeting look in the local newspaper? I think the answer is no. But again, they mirrored the municipal model, and that's what they do. So, I mean, it doesn't talk about email, which didn't exist, 25 years ago when the law was passed. It doesn't talk even about an actual letter sent to every member. And the notice you have to give can be given at the beginning of the year. That says our meetings are going to be the second Tuesday of every month for 2017, or it can be done meeting by meeting. The advantage of the once a year is obviously you're one and done. The disadvantage is if you cancel a meeting that you've already noticed, you got to let people know, because otherwise they're showing up, and that doesn't make people happy. So the practical advice I would give is there are these procedural, somewhat ridiculous requirements. I've always believed that actual notice, an email to a list that is largely inclusive, an actual letter given to an owner. I think a judge would be hard-pressed to say that actual notice to owners is not good enough and you should have put it in the newspaper. Having said that, if you've got particularly controversial issues that the board is going to take action on, maybe you're going to pass a rule that deals with dog behavior that you know is a hotbed issue, give the notice consistent with the statute. Put it in and send it to two local newspapers. By the way, I think every lawyer I've spoken to says they don't have to print it. You just got to send it to them. If they choose to print it, so be it. If they don't, you've done your job. Find a place on the property to post the notice. Again, not because this is meaningful, but because you don't want a procedural flaw infecting an otherwise valid decision that the board may take. So enough about notice. So now the meeting itself. Well, first of all, we ought to mention that there are 4 exceptions to what must be done in an open board meeting. I think most of you know of them. It's contract negotiations, it's issues within the attorney-client privilege, threatened litigation, that sort of thing. It's personnel matters, and it's confidential matters. So within each of those categories, the board can meet in private and can in fact make decisions in private, with the exception of contract negotiations. Obviously, contract negotiations, you can meet with vendors, you can vet them, but you can't actually award the contract to the vendor that you ultimately land on. You must do that in an open session. So with those exceptions, everything else must be voted on at an open meeting. And I know there's certain things that you say, well, do we really need to involve the association in that? For example, the election of annual officers. So you have your election meeting, you now have to organize who your officer is going to be for the next year. Oftentimes you don't want to do that in public, and you can vet it in private, but you need to actually do that in an open meeting. And there's a variety of other issues that I don't want to take the time to go into, but understand that when the gavel comes down, the membership is entitled to see you vote. The other practical advice I would give is that don't just make it a ratification of something that you've already decided in private. The membership won't take kindly to the fact that you're there simply ratifying or confirming decisions, rubber stamping decisions that have been made. At least present the issue to the membership. Have a little colloquy between the board. Everybody pretty much may know how they're going to vote. You may know how everybody's going to vote, but certainly send a message that this is a participatory process. Again, they don't get to vote, but they ought to understand your thought process as you vote. And the other thing you should know about this law is it provides for no opportunity for membership input during the process. When I say it provides for it, doesn't require it. I've always felt that a well-run open board meeting ought to solicit membership input because, again, it's relatively offensive to say to the membership, feel free to show up, but sit there and shut up. So that, find a way to involve them with the understanding that their input is just that, it's input. I've seen it done a variety of ways. I've seen membership input solicited at the beginning of a meeting based on agenda topics. I've seen it's harder, frankly, to do it before the board takes action on each issue, but that's I think the most inclusive way to handle it. So before the board votes, get input. I've also seen it done at the end of the meeting. However, that's relatively offensive because the horse has already left the barn. And now you say, okay, we just picked a landscaper B. Anybody got an opinion? Again, it takes a strong board, and it takes a board willing to lead and to control the flow. That's easier said than done. But I find that well-run open board meetings are a real benefit to the membership. It gives you an opportunity to bring people in, to involve them in the process, and ultimately make the decisions that the board makes easier to enforce because people feel like they've been part of the process rather than having it imposed upon them. So enough from me. Any questions on that? Yes, sir.
Is there any way to remove the board by going to members?
Okay, so the question, I know that I was asked to have questions asked. Maybe it's simpler for me to just repeat the question. So the question, as I understand it, was, is there an opportunity to remove the board without going to the membership? It's very based on your governing documents. I have never seen a set of governing documents, however, that permits the board to remove another board member. The theory is the membership elected them, the membership needs to remove them. What you will find, and sometimes it's misinterpreted, is the board can, in fact, remove a board member's officer position. So you can tell your president he's no longer your president because the board appointed that person president. But you can't tell that president you're no longer president and you're off the board as a whole. Okay?
You get members signed off. Each member signed off.
I don't want to get into the details. It sounds like you have a specific problem that I don't think we should spend the time today. But generally speaking, that's for a membership vote, and that gets tricky and sticky. So, okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to talk about his two topics, which are records retention and what's the other one?
Communicating with residents.
Communicating with residents. Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. As Mike mentioned, my name is Jeff Serkis. I'm going to start with communicating with residents. And as Mike talked about, there are some archaic laws in regards to sending out meeting notice. I'm going to concentrate more today on the practicality of using email and when it's appropriate. So you've probably all been questioned on why the budget includes X amount of dollars for postage, or why we can't just email out everything. In certain communities, that is the preference. However, not everyone in the community may prefer that. Some like to get it still in mail, and also we have to deal with the laws that are in place. So depending on the makeup of your community and what the preferences are there, what we recommend is you start doing both. So for important notices, you're still mailing them, but you're also emailing them out through the community's website or whatever other functions you have, and over time you may have more of an ability to use email more often than not. So when you're sending out email through the community's websites, many times residents can even pick their preference. So if it's something simple like a water shutoff, and they've chosen that they want to receive that by email, that doesn't need to get mailed as well. However, if you have, say, there's 100 units and 15 of them want to receive the notice by mail as well, you can print labels right from that website. so that you're hitting everyone's preferences and also covering your, what's needed there. The last part of that I'll talk about is there are many items that if you do have an amendment, you can utilize email solely for communication. So the amendment can cover pretty much everything except for voting. So if you're doing any other mailings throughout the year, you can utilize email so that you're avoiding that cost and also utilizing the technology that many people prefer, or not all, but many prefer today. So that's really all I have on communicating. Any specific questions on that?
Instead of mailing, can you actually give them out to the unit, at the unit residence store? Like leaving it, like we have a clip for like a calendar and so forth. So can you leave it on there instead of actually just mailing it?
Yeah, if you can slip it under the door and you know that it's the owner and it's not a rented unit, absolutely.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Well, the only exception would be when it comes, for example, to the annual election meeting, your bylaws may well require, put it in the mail,
Right, yes, okay, that's.
as archaic as that may seem.
I don't know if you have any experience with making those robocalls, and have you seen that to be successful?
It depends on the community, and we certainly have communities that use this. What we found is that if email is regularly used, there's no cost to doing so, and that works 9 times out of 10. If not everyone has email and you want to get notice out that the side gate is broken and you need to use the other one, then the robocall certainly does help. And if you're really just trying to cover every base and make sure everyone gets the notice quickly, it does help as well. There are a number of communities that will use multiple forms of communication that way. The reverse texts I've had mixed response with because owners actually have to opt into that service usually. Because there are costs that cellular plans will charge. These services don't want to just assume that everyone is able and willing to get a text.
You didn't mention Facebook.
Yeah, I guess there could be a whole seminar specifically on that.
He said he didn't mention Facebook.
Yeah, if a community already has a Facebook page or there's maybe a group outside of the board that's working on a page, it may be beneficial to have your own Facebook page or forum to kind of control that traffic and have it in a forum that you're able to regularly monitor and answer back as needed. But it is an animal or beast that can sometimes get out of control, and it isn't always the best forum to resolve the issues that are had there. I'd encourage everyone that has specific issues to come to an open meeting and discuss them in that.
In the case of improperly delivering the notice, they may have one notification in the clubhouse, and then for the individual houses, they were placing the notices improperly instead of hand delivering directly to the homeowner door to door. They were posting them and placing them on the inside and outside of the mailbox, which is illegal.
So, yeah, I think in that instance, try to keep it as simple as possible, and perhaps it's best just to mail them to avoid those circumstances. And again, to my earlier points, if you're emailing as well, no one can say that they didn't get the notice.
Okay. Jeff, we're going to move on to the next topic.
All right, I'm going to move on to records retention. So my suggestion here is to review the records of your association, how your management company is handling them, and put together a brief policy so that everyone's on the same page. And I'll talk about 2 different parts to that. So the first are the requirements, and your auditor can likely help you on what those requirements are, on how long you're supposed to keep specific documents. There are ones that need to be permanently retained, things like governing documents, site plans, tax returns, any sort of government communication would be something that you would typically keep permanently. There are a number of other items as well. There are others that by law just need to be retained for 8 years. And that would be your budget, your financials, your accounts payable and receivable files, your contracts and proposals, and things along those lines. Now that we have access to electronic storage, it becomes less of an issue to find a place to store these items. And some of those documents, it may be beneficial to keep longer term. So things like contracts and proposals and minutes as well, it can be very beneficial to go back further than 8 years and have that record, and it's not taking up a whole lot of room. So I'll talk a little bit about different ways to have electronic storage, and keep in mind that these items should not take the place of your management company's internal backed up system for storage, but perhaps there are different tools that can be used for the benefit of the board, of the owners within your community, and just day-to-day workings within the community. So the first, and I think the most important in my mind, is if you have a community website, post important documents up there. And any of the community-specific websites have features that allow you to specify who can view them. So for instance, you set it up so that board members can view contracts, executive meeting minutes, anything else that's a specific working file that you wouldn't share with the membership in that forum. Whereas you may want to share or should share open meeting minutes, governing documents, insurance information, and other things that owners can log on at their leisure and be able to view on that site. And there's two benefits to that. It's kind of a benefit to the owners that at their own time they can log on and not have to contact the management office. And for owners that are working and don't have the ability to call or reach out during the day, they can do that at their own time. And from a management company's perspective, that's then less simple administrative tasks that we necessarily have to handle. So it's a good direction to go in, I think, on both ends. Another tool that can be used, and we've put into place in a number of communities, is a free box, or a free cloud drive, like Dropbox or Box. And the benefit there is that, again, you can control who views what. So for a very active community that has multiple committees, the board may wish to have their finance committee have a section on there, their ACC have a section on there, a social committee have a section on there. And those documents can then be viewed from anywhere. You either log on to the website, www.box.com. You use an app right on your phone, so if the landscape committee is walking around and wants to reference the contract, it's right then and there. And you also have the ability to send out large files or even folders with a link. So when you're doing your annual audit, you can send everything out in one folder in one shot for your auditor, which is helpful. So that's it in a nutshell. Questions?
Is it mandatory that all associations should have audits?
Let me respond to that. The question was, is it mandatory that all associations must have annual audits, certified audits by outside accountants? Again, it depends exactly what your association documents say. It's going to be dictated one way or the other. I will tell you that in my experience, 95% of the communities we manage, the documents do call for certified audits. as opposed to compilations or reviews. I also find that the cost differential between the audit and the lesser scope, work by the accountant is typically not worth the savings, and all the associations we manage do in fact do audits.
If you are changing property managers,
Yeah.
what do you have a suggestion for transferring that hoard of information to a new manager?
So the management company who is going to be retaining their documents internally on their drives, it's standard practice for those documents to be transferred over to the management company. As far as these other, the website or the cloud drive, those are secondary and can easily be transferred over as well. So
Well, the challenge that we face today is what about email? What about, if you have a third-party management company and the email is being, dealt with by the property manager for the third-party management company, if you change management companies, whose email is it? And that's something, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. It's something that you may want to deal with in your contract with your management company. I mean, it is cumbersome. I'm personally involved now in a lawsuit on behalf of one of our communities where they're looking for my email going back to 2006. I guess it's shocking. I'm sorry, 2006, so, 11 years ago. The truth is, we didn't archive it that far back. So there's that issue. So that's a tricky issue, and if you do change, I'm not turning over my email if I lose an account to the new management. So it's something to think about, and it becomes increasingly prevalent. I think we have at least one lawyer in the room, and it's a hard issue, and you may want to ask their input. All right, let's move on so we can make sure we get through this.
Ask a question. The open board meeting, our bylaw was stated 2 times a year. I am afraid it's some kind of in conflict with the state law requirements. And how do you do this correlation? How do you find out what's right in your bylaws and what is wrong? Only through the lawyers is very expensive.
Yeah, the state law doesn't dictate frequency of meetings. So you should go by, the legal requirement is per your governing documents. I will tell you, though, that most associations now meet much more frequently than the minimum required in the governing documents, because if the rule is you have to meet in open session in order to conduct business, it's hard to conduct business twice a year unless you have an association that has very little to do. In fact, I live in a community, and my board president is here, where we in fact we manage some common property. It's not a big deal, and once or twice a year works. But with more active communities with a lot of stuff to manage, it certainly doesn't work. Yes.
Are you suggesting that if the board meets in executive session and takes action and votes on something, that at the open meeting it needs to revisit it and vote again in public?
Exactly. Yep. And it should be on there as ratifying, on the ratification of action previously taken. Yep. No, does not include personnel decisions. Personnel decisions. No, I think not. I mean, personnel action is specifically exempted from the open meetings requirement. So I think you can make decisions in private on personnel decisions and take action on them without ratifying it at a subsequent meeting. Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to not announce you hired a new superintendent, but you don't have to take a vote. Salary, I've never seen disclosed. Yeah.
But if you're working with a management company, you don't know what the community manager is actually.
Well, certainly you don't know what the manager makes, and unless it's a pass-through, contract, I'm not sharing that. But that you may well know what your superintendent makes, what your handyman makes if you're in a building that has its own staff. All right, let's turn to, this is Neil Ross, our other VP, as part of our shuttling in and out. You'll be able to tell the difference between Neil and Jeff. He's the one with the accent. All right, so I want to talk briefly about the effective use of committees and then turn it over to Neil for a couple of topics. So committee management is, well, let me ask the question. How many communities here are 55 and older board members? So a fair number. Certainly committees are most prevalent in active adult communities, not only, but certainly in our active adult communities, we're more apt to have many of them. And the challenge of effectively utilizing those committees is more significant. So just a few practical tips from what, basically the mistakes I've seen made over the years. When you appoint a committee, only appoint the committee. Now, you may have some standing committees called for in the governing documents, but beyond that, appoint the committee as a board only if you think that committee will help you do your job. It's not to simply keep somebody busy. The crank who keeps bothering you, you figure, I know, we'll put him on a committee and maybe he'll go away. They won't go away, and they're going to have a platform to make your life even more miserable. So only appoint committees that are going to further the agenda of the board. And when you do appoint a committee, make clear what you think their job is. We call it a committee charter. I'm sure there's different names for it that you may have used. But you want to describe exactly what you conceive the function of that committee to be, because if you don't, they will. And oftentimes their job description may well be at variance with yours. And there's nothing worse than the board thinking they're appointing a committee to help them, and instead it's created another source of power, and it makes your job harder rather than easier. And you can head it off at the pass by giving some thought in the beginning. What do we really want this finance committee to do? Do we really want them reviewing the general ledger every month and asking us questions about the GL that we already know the answer to because we were intimately involved in the approval of each of those expenses? The answer may be yes, by the way. The answer may be a second set of eyes is a good thing, not a bad thing, but go into it understanding what you think their job is. Now, on the flip side, if you do appoint a committee, try to appoint some people whose opinions and recommendations you're prepared to accept more often than not. Because there's nothing worse in terms of the relationship between a committee and a board than for the committee to spin their wheels, make recommendations, and it falls upon deaf ears with the board. Rather than creating a sense of inclusion, you've teed them off. And to what purpose? So try to pick people who you think will be helpful. That doesn't mean you exclude the occasional dissident. I mean, it is an opportunity for them to have input, but you want to make sure that, if you have a committee made up exclusively of dissidents, the group who says, why don't we have assigned parking? And you finally say, well, fine, you come up with it. And, and the whole committee is made up of people who advocate assigned parking. They come back with a recommendation, and the board has no intention of ever approving an assigned parking policy. So to what end have you accomplished all of that? The other issue is making sure that there's a process in place for the board and your committees to communicate with each other. I guess the most effective way to do that is to have a board liaison to each committee. Be careful that board liaison is not an active participant on the committee. We've certainly seen many board liaisons usurp the authority of the committee, and the committee doesn't have any authority. They're advisory in virtually all cases, with the possible exception of covenants and sometimes architectural review. So make sure that your liaison is there to listen, to once in a while to say, well, you're a little bit off kilter here because the board, has done X, Y, and Z. But for the most part, it's a way for the board to communicate to the committee and for the committee to report back to the board. It's a two-way street, but make sure that, the committee doesn't be overcome by a very strong board member liaison, because that's not the point. So that's it on committees. Any comments, thoughts? Yes?
What would you recommend the size of a committee?
Yeah, good question. And to some extent, the type of committee matters. The social committee, we take all comers, because the more is better. I guess because you have the ability to say, all right, we got a subcommittee for the New Year's Eve party, a different subcommittee for this. When you start talking about architectural review, when you start talking about covenants, to some extent when you start talking about finance, more is not necessarily better. So if you would ask me, it's, in the vicinity of 5. I think it's a little bit like the size of a board. The 9-member boards are a disaster. The boards don't get smarter when they go from 5 to 9. They just get bigger, and they become more cumbersome. So I hope that helps. Any other comments on committees? Yes, in the back.
How would you
to join it?
How would you invite someone to join?
Yeah, and I've seen this done in, I think there's obviously two ways. The one is to put out a call for volunteers for committees, and you know, the danger in that is that you're going to say no to some people if you in fact have committee size limitations. The other alternative is to handpick people that you already know. You already know this one be these 5 people would be good for this committee. You know, there's pluses and minuses to both. Obviously, the problem with hand selecting is you may well be excluding people who you don't know who might be very valid and helpful members of the committee. The advantage of hand selecting, however, is you avoid putting somebody on there who you're concerned may well be a crank, or you avoid having to say no to that person, which creates a whole nother political dilemma. So, yes. Uh-oh.
Two questions. I have two questions. What are your feelings about a board member sitting on a committee as a member? And then secondary, if you were to put out an invitation for your members for your community to sign up for a committee, what are your thoughts about an interviewing process? So you get 20.
Yeah. I don't think board members as members of committees make sense. The board has a job to do. The purpose of the committee is to enhance the job of the board, and if you want to be a member of the committee, you know, it doesn't make any sense to me. And again, I think if you're a member of the committee, it just lends itself to the overbearing board member who usurps the. Yeah, and then a committee then, you know, says, why are we here? In terms of the interviewing, I have seen that done. I think it's an inclusive way to do it. It's also time consuming, depending on how many people you have volunteer. You know, I think that largely may also have to do with the type of committee. I don't think anybody's interviewing social committee members, but you may well want to interview finance committee members to make sure that you've got some people with the requisite, you know, financial acumen to add something to the mix. That doesn't mean you need a finance committee made up of all CPAs. You know, the guy who ran his own business may well be just as valuable to the board on the monthly financials or the annual audit than the CPA. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Neil to cover his topics.
Hi, my name is Neil Ross. I'm a Vice President at Associa. They were going to have me talk about communication, but we didn't think you'd understand me, so just asked me to repeat myself if I talk too quickly. So, association contracting. We're going to take as a starting point for this little session that you've already created a bid specification, that you've bid it out to multiple bidders, and that you've got a proposal back. So our starting point is with the proposal. So I've got 3 examples for you that I wanted to show you. The first is just a simple 1-page proposal. The second is what we call a services agreement. You see it's about 3 or 4 pages. And the third is a full contract. Any guesses which one the attorney prepared? Right. And we laugh, and of course, attorneys cost money, but it's very important as a best practice for your association that you're talking to your attorneys about contracts. So when you get a simple 1-page proposal, there is no language on here that protects the association from anything. It's designed by the contractor. Maybe it has some language that protects the contractor. Maybe it's just got the payment terms. We would strongly encourage you not to sign this 1-page proposal, okay? At minimum, we would encourage you to talk to your attorney or talk to your management company about developing a services agreement. So what's included in that services agreement? You'd have, at minimum, the term of the contract, the scope of the contract. You might want a clause which requires no subcontracting. You want to know who is going to be working in your community, and it was the guy you met with to do the landscaping, not his uncle's second cousin that also has a lawnmower, okay? You want termination language in there. You want insurance requirements in there. Does your contractor have adequate insurance, workers' comp? liability. You want to know what will happen if there's extras. You want a hold harmless clause. So those simple few points can be structured in a service agreement. And at Associa, we do have those sort of 4-page service agreements. And we're comfortable using those for smaller contracts. But anything bigger than that, we really would encourage you to go to your attorney, because while this looks like a lot of work and many errors and a lot of reading, much of this pack is actually made up of the specifications and drawings that the engineers and our contractors provided. So again, if there's one takeaway on this little session, it would be the best practice is to talk to your attorney, and those few $100s spent developing a solid contract will be well worth it on a big construction contract for your association. So a question that we commonly come across is, who should be signing the contract? Any ideas? Who, is it you or is it us? It's you, exactly. We really, unless it's an emergency and we need to get a proposal signed and out the door very quickly, we strongly encourage you as the board members to take responsibility and control over signing that contract. This is not so we can get out of being responsible for it, right? Our job is to get you the bids, make sure the specifications were done correctly, get you all the best information you can, but it's your association. You know, we hope we're going to be your management company, or your management company hopes they're going to be your management company for years to come, but they may not be. And we're agents for you and acting on your behalf, but you represent your homeowners and your association funds. So we really encourage you to sign those contracts. One little side note, and this is going to depend on the type of contract, but some of your governing documents may require unit owner approval for contracts over a certain dollar amount. Now, that's not in all documents, but it's in many, so I'd really encourage you as a board to make sure you're familiar with those clauses within your governing documents before you sign a contract, all of a sudden to find out 6 months later when something goes wrong that there's a revolt amongst the homeowners because they weren't consulted because of the dollar value of the contract. And last but not least, I just wanted to provide a kind of best practice. There are dozens of different types of contracts that your association will be involved in. It's not just the one-off contract for repaving the parking lot. You've got contracts with your management company, with your snowplow company, with your auditors, with your attorneys, and it's hard to keep track of those. So we really encourage our managers and boards to develop a contract calendar. It can sit within their regular system that they're using for managing your property, but it should be visible to you and be an ongoing tool for knowing when the audit needs to be renewed. You know, you might have a multi-year landscaping contract which is coming up for renewal. Your management contract will be coming up for renewal. And while they may have clauses to hold over month to month, you're typically better off renegotiating those contracts, and a simple calendar can help you do that. Anyone have any questions on contracting? Yes.
What happens when you have a community manager sign a board president's name on their behalf?
Yeah, the lady at the front here asked, what happens if a community manager signs as the board member using their signature?
Using the board member's signature.
Using the board member's name and then their initials underneath.
Oh, I would be troubled by that, to put it mildly. Yeah. Yeah, so clearly that's a prime example of where having gone to the association attorney was the right thing to do. I mean, look, you know, in a perfect world, the board signing everything. Of course, we have been in situations where we have signed as an agent on behalf of, but it's really in situations where there is an emergency or timing doesn't allow the process to run properly. Yes?
What is the minimum you would suggest to use the lawyer?
A minimum dollar value. Yeah, Mike and I had this argument over lunch yesterday. So, like, there's no straight answer to that. Obviously, it's going to depend on the your budget? Are you a $5 million a year budget or a $100,000 a year budget? I think the best practice is anything over a relatively small, 4 figures and up, I think, at minimum you should be using that services agreement. And if you develop that with your attorney as a one-off for smaller contracts, then you have it in place.
Nowadays, it's 275 is the minimum cost per lawyer. And you're saying, negotiating a $3,000-4,000 contract, it doesn't make sense.
Exactly, and that's where that services agreement, it may take them 2 hours to do it initially, but then you have that model for your association going forward for smaller contracts. Let's leave it at that.
Question with regard to reserves. In other words, if we're talking contracts, we're an established association on our own, and we established a contract many, many years ago with a broker to hold our capital reserve funds, and they do a good job for us. But that contract has never really ever been looked at, or in my eyes, it's still the same when we first did it. And I'll say, maybe close to 20 years ago. So, when is the right time to get, let's say, another look at the contract? And should, in fact, since the funds are actually being transferred from the operating account to the fund account through the help of the management company, should there be 2 signatures on that contract?
So let me just take that, and then we're going to need to move on. The truth is, that what we're really talking about is not the contract with the broker, because if you get a contract from Morgan Stanley, it's not going to address the issues that you just did. You need to have an investment policy with your investment advisor that talks about who gets to sign reserve checks. It talks about who's giving the broker advice as if there's a CD rolling over, who's authorized to tell them to either do it or not do it. It really needs to be a standalone document. Morgan Stanley is typically not putting that together for you. That's got to be something between the association, the board, and you're an individual investment advisor.
In the governing documents. In other words, that's what I'm
It's typically done as a resolution, from my experience.
Okay, so we do have a resolution in place, and then that has the coverage that I need.
Yeah.
Correct.
And if that's recorded, then that's public, yeah. Okay. All right, I'm just going to move, I have one more topic to talk about quickly, which is new board member orientation. So how many of you were a new board member or had ever been on a board when you joined your condo board? Was it this the first time on a board for any of you? Okay, and that's fairly typical. For a lot of people, joining the HOA or condo association board is the first time they've ever been on a board. And clearly, you're the conscientious type of board member that's come to learn about the industry and about association management and about being a board member, so that's great. But not everyone can rely on that, and so there's a few best practices we wanted to discuss to get you trained as a board member and some resources we wanted to share. So, a lot of being on a board, I don't need to tell you, is about dealing with personalities and politics and people management, okay? So, that's the kind of art of being a board member, and I don't know that you can teach that. That's something that you learn over time. But on the governance side, there's a lot of things that you do need to know and understand. In the old days, for any of you that learned in the old school method, they probably gave you a big book like this, your governing documents or POS, and said, read it and learn it, okay? We know that that's not really happening, and the only people that are really doing that, hopefully, are your management company, because we're paid to make sure we understand everything that's in these documents.
Or those who can't sleep at night.
Yeah. So, what we do at Associate, and what we would encourage you to talk to your management company about doing for new board members, is have an orientation from either your property manager or one of the leadership team at your management company. What does that mean? That means we're going to have reviewed and understood your governing documents, and we're going to be able to help guide you through those documents to understand, sections in the master deed. What is a condominium unit? What's the common elements? What are the requirements for being a board member? The simple, important areas that we can pull out and highlight for your association. And those are different from association to association, obviously, and that's why that orientation being run by a management company is important. We typically like to do, or you should be getting, an introduction to the financial statements. You know, very few boards are lucky enough to have a CPA on them, so we understand, or unlucky enough, depending on your point of view. So we understand that getting that financial pack every month can be a challenge. Having someone explain that at the first meeting or two, being willing to answer questions and guide you through it is important. We also encourage you to take a look at your association's operating calendar. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that your manager's doing at your association that when you get on the board, you start to learn about. You know, simple things like getting the pool ready on time or making sure the snow contract's in place is one thing, but there will be lots of preventative maintenance items and other things that when you learn and understand, it's going to give you a much more broad understanding of how the association runs. So that's important too. And finally, I just wanted to know if you are an association that is in transition, in developer transition, there's going to be special requirements that you're going to need to understand. So if you're in that situation, obviously there'll be conversations you may need to have with your management as well as engineers and attorney. And on that note, I really would, your professionals that you hire, your attorney, auditor, engineers will be more than happy to come and talk to you as a board and explain what their role is and help you understand your role. And last but not least, CAI, the Community Associations Institute, is an invaluable resource for board members. If you go onto their website, there's a whole section on community association volunteer leaders, which you all are. Great learning resources on there, and your manager should also be able to guide you to that area of the site. Okay, I know we're running out of time, so I will stop there. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to deal quickly with two other topics, and maybe we leave a few minutes for questions. First, I wanted to talk about municipal services. As I guess everybody knows, in 1993, the Municipal Services Act was put in place in New Jersey. It was intended to deal with the inequality of the fact that community associations had private roads and oftentimes private trash removal and street lighting, whereas if you lived on a public street, your taxes paid for all of those things. So the law was an attempt, and not a perfect attempt because it didn't cover everything, to deal with that. Just a couple of thoughts. First of all, CAI's Legislative Action Committee has for years had a wish list of, you know, if I were king, what would I do to fix the law? Because it clearly doesn't cover everything, and what it does cover, it doesn't cover perfectly. We haven't gotten any traction there because the truth is, after the recession in 2008, you know, municipalities were very careful about their budgeting, and the truth is, every state legislator was once the mayor of his town. And therefore, they understand that, you know, the more costs that you impose upon the municipality for the benefit of a community association, the more it's costing everybody else. So we have a whole list of things we would do if king. However, we recently have some traction that we're excited about. One of the worst omissions in the law is fire hydrants on private streets. Fire hydrants on private streets are not covered by the law. So associations are typically not only paying for the standby water fees of hydrants, and you may not even know that you're paying for them or what you're paying, but New Jersey American up this way, their charges are usurious. I mean, last I looked, you're paying roughly $1,500 a year just to know that there's water in a given hydrant should you need it. It's terrible. But almost worse than that is not only the cost, but who's maintaining that hydrant. So that when the house is on fire and the fire truck pulls up, and you know, I've spoken to other managers who have had this happen, and the fire department goes to turn on the spigot on the hydrant, it doesn't work because there has not been preventative and routine maintenance done on that hydrant. So we think we finally have some traction with a bill that would impose the obligation to maintain on the municipality and require that the municipality either pay for the hydrant fees directly, or at a minimum, the town gets a discount off the provider's water bill. New Jersey American, I think, charges municipalities a third of what they charge us, or what they charge you. So we're looking for either pay it or at least give us the benefit of your reduced rate. We think we've got some traction. We've got some traction because the firefighters have gotten behind this because they're concerned and frankly ought to be concerned. You know, are they going to be sufficiently protected when they come up to this hydrant, and is it going to work? So that's where and the other thing on municipal services, don't assume your town's going to come to you and say, by the way, you haven't filed your application for your reimbursement this year. You need to initiate it. You know, some towns indeed will come to you, most won't, and there is a gotcha game that they play. Many ordinances say that you got to file for 2016's reimbursement by March 31st of 2017. Know what the requirement is, make sure your manager knows what the requirement is, and make sure you do it. Just a few words on ADR. We could talk for an hour about ADR only. Just know that the law now is that all associations must have a mechanism in place other than litigation to resolve disputes between owners in the association and between owners within the association. As time has gone on, the scope of what in fact must be subject to ADR has grown. The statute in the Condo Act, not in the other law that covers everybody else, does condition it on it being a housing-related dispute. Unfortunately, the latest law is housing-related, also covers collection matters. You know, who would have thought? But it does. Just what you do with that, you ought to talk to your association attorney about. Do you really need to offer ADR every time you send out a Dunning collection letter? And what's the downside if you don't? But it's a minefield. There are a variety of ways to confer ADR. As an association, have one in place, or at least have a mechanism in place. It doesn't necessarily need to be internal to your association. CAI has a mediation service that they offer. The only thing that's clear is it cannot be the board. So if you've got a dispute between the association and a member, the board can't sit to provide ADR for obvious reasons. It also can't sit in judgment of two owners who may be fighting with each other. So enough. We got a couple of minutes for any questions that you may have about the things we ran out of time on. Sir.
Quick question. Does the association board have to have minutes of the meetings?
Yes. Yes. Well, let's be careful. Open board meetings must have minutes. Executive sessions do not have to have minutes, although it's good practice to record what was done in an executive session. But if there is a recording made of an executive session, those minutes are not subject to distribution to the membership, because otherwise the whole idea that executive sessions are not supposed to be open to the membership doesn't work if you can meet in private, but you got to give the minutes out when you're done. Okay, sir.
In terms of 16 bids, are there any requirements when the board have discretion to say in this situation we should go to this person, or in this situation we have to?
Okay, so the question was, in terms of awarding contracts after you get bids, is there any requirement? First of all, you need to look at your governing documents. Most of them do not require a minimum number of bids. Some do. I'm not familiar with any that say you must take the lowest bidder, the lowest responsible bidder, as does exist in the municipal context. So I think the short answer to your question is, unless the documents say otherwise, most associations and boards are entitled to pick the bidder that they're most comfortable with, even if it's not the lowest number. Yeah, again, and you know, CAI for years has tried to get a law passed that talks about a bidding statutory requirement. There is none. So unless your governing document talks about it, there is no minimum number of bids required. I think a best practice is to not necessarily go out to bid every year on every service, but to go out to bid every several years for every service, because at some point, even though you're comfortable with a vendor, you don't know that the market hasn't changed and they haven't changed with it. Anybody else? Yeah.
Just to piggyback on what he said, when we go out to bid, and right now we're doing it again for snow and landscaping, did you say at the beginning that the membership, the owners have to be there while we're picking these things? We pick our own based on the bids, and we make our own decision.
What I said was the board can interview candidates and vet, vendors and negotiate contracts. But the awarding of the contract, once you make when you're making that selection, must be done in an open meeting. At the open meeting, you're voting, they're not, but they do get to watch you vote.
Okay, even though we only have 2 open meetings a year, you're saying whenever we're doing this, we have to make it.
The challenge of not having a lot of open meetings is you need to time it. Ideally, you ought to time it in such a way that, and it's hard with only 2 meetings a year. You know, what you're then confronted with oftentimes with a minimal number of meetings is you're ratifying decisions that have already been made, and perhaps the landscaping season's halfway over. You know, I don't think that's consistent with the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is the membership's supposed to see you vote before the horses left the barn, not after it's already, 3 miles away. Okay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.